Black Ops 6 is going to change everything. It will be the biggest, most popular, and most loved Call of Duty game ever released. For about a month or two, and then everybody will hate it. I'm Peach, welcome to the pit. And I'm going to break down why this exact scenario happens every single year at every Call of Duty release. Since nearly the very beginning of the franchise, Call of Duty has been on an alternating development cycle between several different studios. From Call of Duty 2 all the way up to Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, there were two studios, each taking 2 years to create a Call of Duty game. These studios being Infinity Ward and Treyarch, and the publisher being Activision. During this time period, Infinity Ward and Treyarch staggered their releases, so that way a brand new Call of Duty game would release every single year in the fall. As games got bigger with better graphics and more complicated systems, it would take more time and resources to create each Call of Duty. Which is why in 2014, a third studio, called Sledgehammer Games, joined the fray of alternating developers. This allowed each studio to now spend 3 years developing their game. And every one of these studios uses the same game engine, but each modified it in their own way that created a consistent feel and overall experience between the games, but still left some room to make it their own and feel a little more unique. That way, whenever you picked up a new COD, you knew what kind of experience you were going to be getting, but it still provided some freshness in how it played. But then a couple years ago, starting with the new MW2, all COD games started using the same game engine for seamless integration with the free-to-play Warzone mode, which means now they all feel more alike than ever. So because of this development cycle and the use of the same game engine, COD games and their fans go through a very predictable pattern, myself included. First off, because a new COD game releases every year, post-launch support generally only lasts until the next game comes out. This means no new maps, no new bug fixes, and eventually the security of the game stops getting updated as well, so hackers come in full force. For this reason, it's usually in the best interest of the player, if they want to keep having fun, to move on to the next game. Because the current one will be inundated with cheaters, and with no new content or fixes, there's very little reason to stick around. This is basically a form of what is called planned obsolescence, which is the idea that a company will design a product with a very limited lifespan in order to sell you on the next product. Some great examples of this include Apple intentionally slowing down their old iPhones so you have to buy a newer one, or IKEA designing their furniture to only last about 5 to 10 years before it needs to get replaced. Or my favorite example, light bulbs only lasting about 2,000 hours, even though the technology is there for light bulbs to last over 100 years.
You want the numbers, Mason. That's all we've ever wanted.
On a side note, if you go down that rabbit hole, you will not come back.
We get dirty, and the world stays clean.
And Call of Duty games are built on the idea of a 1-year life cycle. And of course, you can play the game past that, but the post-launch support is only planned and designed for that limited shelf life. Because if a game doesn't maintain support, the majority of the player base will quickly leave to a game that is maintaining support. What are you doing? The game shut down! You just sitting at the menu? Call of Duty primarily handles its post-launch support through providing free content updates while selling premium skins for the game's operators. But as I mentioned earlier, they only do this for a year. Then everything stops and there's generally no more updates. You can only milk a cow for so long, yes sir. All of this is done to encourage the player to buy the current Call of Duty game, spend money over the year on skins or in past years on map packs, and then because the support for the game stops and skins don't carry over, you're encouraged to buy the next game and repeat the process, thus maximizing Activision's profits. But this doesn't only increase revenue, it also keeps Call of Duty fresh. The thing with gamers, consumers, and people in general is we love the familiar, as it gives us something to identify with and attach to. And that's why it's generally so hard for people to switch brands, because their favorite one is so familiar, and it can become a part of their identity. But using the same thing over and over again also eventually becomes boring. And the other core aspect of consumers is we love to have new stuff. We constantly want something new that can trigger those feel-good chemicals in our brain, such as dopamine. But if the thing is too different, it'll simply turn us off, because our caveman brain isn't sure if this might be dangerous or will simply waste our time. In general, it costs about 7 times more to acquire a new customer than to retain an old one. And this translates across industries and in video games as well. We want to play games that we know we love, but we also get bored of them. And companies know that it is much easier to sell an existing franchise than start a new one and try to build it up. Hence why the market is flooded with sequels, reboots, and remasters. They take what we love, are familiar with, and identify with, and add enough newness to it to make us become engaged again. And Call of Duty does this masterfully. Every game release feels brand new and exciting. This translates into good reviews, lots of online discussion from YouTubers and content creators about the different aspects of the game, and everybody's having fun. But then, as soon as the newness of the game starts to wear off, the cracks and issues start to show. and we slowly get more and more bored of the game as each new content update becomes less and less exciting. But don't worry, just as you're starting to get bored, the marketing for the next game starts ramping up, and you've got an entirely new product to get excited about. And out comes another Call of Duty game with new maps, new mechanics, and a new experience that feels familiar but is different enough to get people on board. But it's a bit of a catch-22, because the game being so familiar also makes it get boring quicker, which creates a bit of a vicious cycle. Another fact about consumers that feeds into this cycle is we tend to have a very short memory. If there's a controversy, if something bad happens, we tend to forget about it pretty quick. You can just look at the news to get a great example of this. There's so many massive life events that people completely forget about and don't speak of a couple of weeks after it happens. This phenomenon also gets coupled with the fact that as humans, we tend to focus on the highlights of memories that go above and beyond the minute-to-minute moments. If you go to Disneyland and feel completely miserable walking around the park in the hot sun, waiting for hours in line, the food's overpriced, and maybe it doesn't even taste that good, maybe a trip and hit your knees.
What?
And you just have an overall bad time except for a few minutes of pure joy and bliss on the rides. When you look back on that trip, you are much more likely to look back on it fondly and focus on the fun you had, that being the highlights, and not on the bad parts, that being the minute-to-minute moments. Both the short-term memory and focusing on the highlights lead us to remember events differently than how they actually occurred. For example, you might look back super fondly on the original MW2 and think the game was perfect, but you might not remember the frustration of one-man army, noob tubes, and the lack of post-launch updates, among other issues. This is what causes players to always look back on previous Call of Duties with fondness and claim that the current one just isn't as good as the last, or isn't as good as they used to make them back in the day. Although I will die on the hill that there's not a campaign better than World at Wars. On the ledge! And I mean, hey, everybody has different opinions, and maybe the new CODs are much worse than the old ones. Or maybe they're better. But there's a very good chance that we aren't remembering the whole picture of how we felt when we played them back in the day. And this leads me into the final reason that makes a lot of people end up hating the current COD. Is because for a lot of players, it's not competing against other games that release at the same time or even the previous Call of Duty. It's competing with nostalgia. The reality is, for this current COD that just came out, we didn't grow up playing it, which means it won't have the same impact on our brain as the previous ones when we think about it. Nostalgia psychologist Alan Hirsch links nostalgia to a yearning for the past. After all, who doesn't want to return to a simpler time? Childhood, adolescence, playing games with friends after school, LAN parties, and no stresses or worries. Research has shown that nostalgia is a common response to change. And as such, when we're going through a transition in our lives, be it becoming an adult, graduating, getting married, having kids, etc., we are driven to that nostalgic yearning for the past and that simpler time. And that's why no Call of Duty will ever truly be able to live up to the older ones, because the new ones can't replicate that special time in our lives when we played the old ones. Nothing will.
What's up, guys? We're gonna f you up.
But that's where we create new memories.
You're coming with me to the shower.
No!
Yup.
And what's funny is that in 10 years, when life changes even more, we might look back on Black Ops 6 as the nostalgic good old days, or future generations will look back on it as their childhood COD. Or maybe it'll actually just suck. Who knows? But if you don't like it, it doesn't matter too much because the next one's out soon anyway. But hey, that's marketing, and this cycle will probably continue until the end of days. If you like the video, hit subscribe and comment down below your thoughts. And if you want to check out why the Halo rebrand is almost meaningless, or a deep dive into the scariest horror game that never got released, click on one of the videos on screen. And until next time, stay peachy.